Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for our very first Community Connections on Zoom. We hope that this will give us a chance to talk with volunteers and even volunteer organizations in our community to hear about the good work that is already taking place and find out how we can get involved. So we all can't do everything that needs to be done, but I hope that as we're educated about things that are happening in our community and as we're informed that maybe we all can find a place to serve where our truest selves can be present. So tonight, I think already may be a little different than what we had already planned, because I began talking about this with Deborah before the war in Ukraine began. And so Dr. Alexander has been working with refugees in Afghanistan, and after a long career with the U.S. State Department there, but with her experience in so many places, including Ukraine, I think we'd be remiss not to touch that topic as well. So we'll see where the discussion leads this evening as we talk. So thank you so much, Deborah, for taking time to be here and to share with us. You kindly sent along your bio, and I thought I would highlight some of that for folks just because I think it will really help maybe folks to be able to see some of the questions that they might be able to ask because of the breadth of your experience and expertise. By the time I was done, it was all highlighted. So there was a lot of interesting stuff. So I'll have to leave some things out, but we'll hit some of the high points. Okay, so and you can feel free to interrupt and stop me at any time and correct me on any of this if we get it wrong. So Dr. Alexander is a former U.S. Department of State senior advisor and political officer. She went to EKU, earned a PhD at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, specialized in political psychology and women's studies. After September 11th, went to Afghanistan, requested to go there, served there for 10 years, and was one of the first civilians to enter Afghanistan, which I wasn't aware that you were one of the first. Among other places, is working in Iraq, Kosovo, Bosnia, Serbia, Pakistan, Somalia, and Ukraine, focused on elections, women's advancement, and countering violence, and also oversaw U.S. assistance to the first presidential and parliamentary elections in Afghanistan and became political advisor there to U.S. and NATO commanders. So there's also a multitude of awards from U.S. State Department, State Expeditionary Service Awards, NATO Public Service Awards, and it goes on and on. And also, one thing that came out randomly as we were talking one day, when you said, when I was driving for Mother Teresa, and I was like, which Mother Teresa? Whose my mother's name was not Teresa. Was your mother's name? No, Mother Teresa. So as a Fulbright scholar in India, when that began your love of global affairs, and has also represented the U.S. on several election observation missions in Kazakhstan, Russia, Georgia, Ukraine, and on and on. I'm so grateful that you're here to talk with us tonight and to help us know a little more about what's going on in our community with the work that you've done with Afghan refugees, but also so that we can hear from your wealth of experience actually abroad in Afghanistan and in the region to kind of give us an idea of how we can be of service here, but to just understand more about what's happening in our world too. So there's so much that we can talk about. You want to start by telling us a little bit about your background and your work in Afghanistan, unless you want to go back farther first.
I think you've covered my bio pretty well. First of all, though, I told you
I highlighted it all.
I'm so pleased and honored, though, that I get to be the first one in our Community Connections Zoom. I remember that's such an honor. Thank you so much. And I feel so fortunate because I know I'm among friends. So I feel like I'm looking forward to this conversation. So thanks, Erin, for the invitation. It does mean a lot to me. I don't make a big distinction between our community service here in Lexington in central Kentucky, and the work that I did in Bosnia or Ukraine or Afghanistan. For me, there is this continuum of how we serve. And I've just been fortunate to be able to be a part of a lot of different ways of serving that starts both with our community here, but also, of course, goes all the way to Afghanistan, Russia, and the other places that you mentioned too. I was, trained as a social worker and initially at EKU, and then I went on to political psychology. But I just see that the work that we do in our community and the work that we do abroad, there's a similar linkage to all of that work. I got to Afghanistan because you said it. It was 9/11, and that was my area of specialization with the Department of State, was working in crisis communities. And also, I think I was one of the few people. My mother had worked for U.S. Army as a civilian, and I have both my stepfather and father were U.S. Army vets. And I chose specifically not to go to the Army when I got out of Bryan Station High School. But I also wasn't afraid of Army. I wasn't afraid of military folks. And so wherever we had U.S. military deployed, I ended up becoming that go-to person for the State Department. They would say, let's get Deborah Alexander into Bosnia, into Kosovo. She knows how to talk to those military types. And so it was really sort of like, my engagement with military, my experience in governance and elections, my commitment to how is it that we help a country in crisis. And that sort of came together about how I ended up in the various places that I did, including Ukraine.
Yeah. No. And so many vastly, so many different places that you went to with that. Was there something that led you early on to work with those places in crisis that really kind of drew you to that?
It's an expertise that I developed, but there wasn't a plan, and I often, when I was a young person here in Kentucky, I thought I had a plan about my life. And of course, plans change. And I was going to be a social worker. And my first job, in fact, was at the Blackburn Correctional Complex as a counselor for lifers. And then from there, I had a couple of other social work jobs. But then I became very interested in the policy behind that. Why is it that we have certain policies that do this or do that? And I was always interested in communities in conflict. And so, there were a couple of different strains of interest. And, but really the reason that State Department came calling was because I had developed this, in New York State, I had mediated a number of conflicts between Republicans and Democrats, because I worked for the Speaker of the New York State Assembly at one point. And before that, I had mediated some actual conflicts between gangs in New York City. And then I was appointed to the State Board of Elections because I had an interest in how do we peacefully decide on policy? How do we think about policy? How do we think about representation? The old kind of, ballots, not bullets. And that seemed to me to be a really good way that we think about how do we mediate conflict? How are we represented in public discussions? How do we influence domestic and foreign policy is through our electoral process. So all that sort of experience sort of ended up coming together in my electoral and governance work. And then that was the work that State Department came calling and said, we need somebody that knows how do you stand up a new government in a country in conflict? How do you work with warring gangs? How do you work between different arguing factions? And I think all that came together. So that's sort of how I ended up being. But it was never my intention at Bryan Station High School or at EKU. And it's just that, life gives us opportunities if we look for them.
That's really interesting how you found your way to that. And then two, I think I know what I know the word diplomat, but I wasn't thinking about how being a diplomat means you may always be in conflict. You may always be in a place where you're always trying to help two sides, see eye to eye. Did that come natural to you or like I think about doing that and I feel like I would be nervous all the time, just constantly was that something that was kind of naturally part of who you are? Or was it something that you had to learn to be okay with it?
It's an interesting question. I would say it's not an either or answer, probably. I was always interested in, even when I was a child and I would see arguments in my family, and I would always think, well, he's right, but also she's right. I sort of understand what both of them are saying. And I can remember that even as a child, sort of being interested in the fact that there's always different perspectives. And I was always committed to how is it that you listen to one another and you acknowledge what we're saying, but I wanted to make sure that people didn't come to blows, that people didn't hurt one another, to try to find a way to understand one another. So I think, that just was the kind of kid I was. And I think that did sort of form my interest in social work and psychology later, and eventually diplomacy. But I also had to take classes. I took a number of classes at our, State Department Institute in negotiations, for instance.
Right. Oh, that's fascinating. That even from a young age, we're always trying to be the peacemaker and find the way. That's great. Well,
sometimes a troublemaker, but
well, we don't have to talk about that. We'll redact that. Can you tell us a little bit about as we maybe move into thinking about the refugees who have had to come to the United States after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan? Can you talk to us a little bit about that, about the U.S. withdrawal and maybe the struggles that the refugees have faced since then?
Sure. We here in Kentucky, in central Kentucky, we've had probably about 175 Afghans, and that includes family units and children. In Kentucky, we've had, I think, around 625 is about the number of families that have come here. The ones that have come to Lexington are all the families that were evacuated in August, in that sort of terrible last 10 days of Afghanistan, when the Taliban was able to march in to Kabul, and when the government of Afghanistan collapsed. And we all saw the horrible pictures of people rushing to the airport, clinging onto planes, trying to get out. And so, as you know, the U.S. and many of our allies, France, England, Canada, Norway, many of them tried to evacuate people out during that limited time. And so the people that we have resettled here are of that group. And there are a number of benefits that have been provided for them by the federal government and by Governor Bashir to get them started in their first new months here. There's a lot of challenges, not only language and religion, but many of them, one thing that we have to appreciate about Afghans is that Afghans have layer upon layer of trauma. And unlike other immigrants, and many immigrants do, I don't want to play that down, but Afghans have a unique layer on layer on layer of trauma. In 1973, it was a democratic monarchy who was actually introducing democratic reforms. Women could vote, a number of other kind of democratic reforms. And then there were a series of coups, very bloody coups, of shifting between a democratic monarchy being taken over by a communist, and then shifting back. And then in 1979, Russia marches in. And then there was a 10-year war that followed. Finally, Russia withdrew in 1989. And then the country fell into civil war because there had been no sort of rule of law and order, any kind of stability for years. And so you had your various your various factions, both political, but also ethnic and religious factions. And it ended up dissolving into a civil war. And it was in that kind of chaos in 1996 that this group called the Taliban, who are basically, Taliban means scholars or children of the faith or students of the faith, that there was a need in the country for some stability. And so the Taliban was able to come into this country on these promises of stability. And then we know that they ended up being an extremist radical regime. I don't have to recount some of the many, many abuses, but, just to remind us of executions in the soccer stadium. Women were not allowed to go outside the home. Girls could no longer be educated. Men had to do all the shopping. Men had to grow full beards. No music, no movies, and it goes on and on. And then, then we, of course, had 9/11, and the U.S. and UK go to Afghanistan. And then what follows from that is a 20-year war. And then we had the return of the Taliban. So I just recount all that history just so that we really understand that children and adults, if they are under the age of 60, they have it's been trauma after trauma and instability. And so I feel like our newest Afghan neighbors, there's a lot of need there, particularly mental health services. And there's a real shortage of that. We're really having a hard time finding counselors and the kind of medical benefits they can qualify for to provide those services. And like any other immigrant group, they're struggling with finding housing for them. They're getting their Medicaid cards. So they have, I've been amazed about some of the advances of the last 5 months, but it's not an easy assimilation for them. And I'm also struck, Aaron, to think about watching, and I have a deep affection for Ukraine too, because I worked in Ukraine 5 different postings. And so I find it very strange at this point that I'm sort of, on one hand, working with Afghan refugees here. I'm also trying to help evacuate Afghans out of Afghanistan who want to leave. And I'm also now involved with helping colleagues and friends leave Ukraine. And I'm intrigued with and saddened a little bit about the fact that there's much more interest in helping Ukrainian refugees than there are Afghan refugees. But with that said, we have some terrific services here in Lexington. The Kentucky Refugee Ministries provide a lot of support, and they're the first organization that our new Afghan neighbors meet when they come into Lexington. And we also have an organization called the Community Response Coalition, which is sort of interfaith, interorganizational group of folks that provide everything from, like, I went out and bought some rugs from Afghans that needed some prayer rugs, to delivering food on Saturdays, to teaching them to go out to grocery stores and how to do, price comparisons. So those two organizations are terrific. And then some of our faith communities, not only Central Baptist, but some of our Jewish brothers and sisters and our Muslim brothers and sisters at the mosque and others have also pitched in. So there's a number of different ways that we can be a part of helping Afghan refugees in our community.
Yeah, well, that's great. And you don't think often about the opportunities as being like, well, helping somebody go to the store and,
Easy.
Purchasing some rugs or something like that. There's it sounds like there's lots of different opportunities and ways for folks to be involved.
There is everything from tutoring English to doing a democracy course, which I'm planning on doing soon, or a civics course, really more, to just going to Walmart with them and helping them read labels because, of course, they don't want to buy things that have pork products. Right. Simple things like that, taking them to a doctor's visit for COVID vaccinations. And so there's a full range, or even just writing a letter to our senators and our congressmen advocating on behalf of continued support for Afghanistan. So it can be writing a letter all the way to spending time with a family, to doing a baby shower, to English classes, many different ways to help.
Yeah. Well, it's good to hear that so many things are being done. I know that we actually have some links on our website. I'll get the URL and put it on here too. That we've put up with links that will tell you a little bit more about it and also help you get to the KRM website. And also, I cannot recall the name of the second organization.
We call it just CRC, but yeah. It's right. Community Resources Coalition.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Community Resources Coalition. So yeah, to both of those places, you'll find ways to sign up on there and to help out. I didn't realize also, I didn't think about these places offering courses in English. That's a comprehensive service for folks. And so
it's also financial literacy because, we have to presume Afghans, and this is true of all immigrants, they come from a different environment. And so how to sort of manage their money and checking accounts, banking. Many countries do not have banking systems like we do. They have a very different sort of transactional system. And so, I've worked with families that have never had a microwave. They've never been able to flip lights on. So, we just have to realize that there's a lot that our new neighbors are having to learn. And so there's ways to assist that too. So.
Yeah, it's good to know too that there's something often we think, what can I do? How can I really help? What expertise do I have to offer in this dire situation? But helping folks manage some of those changes from culture to another can be done by so many of us.
I think that's one reason why community service is so important to me because, sometimes now that I'm retired, I can't be there at the White House in a meeting on what our future policy is about helping Afghanistan. But I can be here in Lexington helping resettle our families. And so, it doesn't have to be something big. We find ways to help, and there's so many different kinds of ways to help too. There's a young group of Afghan women that have come to me, and they're trying to better understand what their opportunities are for working and for going to college, for instance. And so there's so many possible conversations that we can be a part of and ways that we can be a part of, helping these immigrants.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, let's talk a little bit too about Ukraine, since you have so much experience there. And are there ways locally that things that we can do to help folks in Ukraine right now?
Well, I'm sure that everyone saw that I had posted on our Central Baptist Church Facebook page the Ukrainian bake sale and lunch that they had this past Saturday. And that bake sale ended up making national news last night because they raised almost $146,000 at a bake sale. Would my Girl Scout troop have loved to have that kind of bake sale? But they were able to raise, and they magnificent bakers. And so it was a terrific day for the local Ukrainian Pentecostal church. So ways that we can help locally is certainly I'm staying in touch with that church, but there's also a host of both US-based organizations and European-based organizations and Ukrainian organizations that need financial support. So it's maybe giving $5 or $100. It's staying connected to the Ukrainian Pentecostal Church here. It's monitoring the news so that we're understanding what's really going on. It's there are a number of Facebook groups of Ukrainians who are looking for assistance. Maybe they need, if you have family in Poland or Romania or Slovakia, and you just, can give them 3 or 4 nights of someplace to stay safely. Maybe it's a doctor who can do a telemed, a consultation with one of the maternity hospitals. And so I find that there's a lot of different ways that we can try to support the Ukrainians in this very difficult time. And there's also ways that we can show our, be a little fun in our subversive behavior. I saw, for instance, the Russian cosmonauts recently, last week, went on to the International Space Station, but they were dressed in Ukraine's colors. Ooh. A little way of making the point there. Dave Beckham, who, soccer superstar, he turned over his Facebook page and his Instagram account to a doctor in Ukraine for the day so that she could talk about the needs of the hospital and of the preemies that they've delivered. And so it's interesting to me, we can do emails. We can talk to our legislators about supporting Ukraine. We can post on our Facebook and Instagram and Twitter feeds, a supportive statement about them. We can support the local church. And so I think, there's all kinds of ways that we can be a positive force for the Ukrainians right now.
Yeah. Especially with a congregation so close to us that we can. So that's great.
Yeah, Mark and I and Donna went to a prayer service there one Friday night, and I have to admit, Donna and I hadn't been in a Pentecostal service for a while. It was something. And I had a couple of my Jewish friends with me. But we were there to show support. So it was, I know they appreciated it.
Oh, well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for talking with us tonight and for sharing all your expertise. I want to give some folks a chance to ask some questions too. So we're going to open it up for some more questions for Deborah. If you all have any questions that you'd like to ask.
Will we find the Ukrainians more appealing to invite here than I've gone blank on the other country.
Afghans?
Afghanistan.
It's a great question, and it's a tough one because already just in the last 3.5 weeks, there's been a number of congressional intents about revising immigration laws that make it easier for Ukrainians to come into the U.S., either temporarily or permanent. But the restrictions for Afghans are horrific and strict. And so it's a little disappointing that they're thinking about making it so much easier for Ukrainians, whereas the very people who helped us and who suffer most in a 20-year war, Congress hasn't taken it upon themselves to make it easy at all for them to immigrate to the U.S. again, this is my opinion only, but I think it's because Ukraine is white, they're European, and they're Christian. And I just feel like people, and it's also true that the circumstances are, we can all sympathize with Russian tanks and air power invading a country. And so for all those reasons, I think that there's a greater sympathy. And I think there's still, sadly, a prejudice that Afghans who dress differently, who are maybe a little more brown, who are Muslim, who might be terrorists or who might have been associated with 9/11. And so there seems to be sort of there's a distrust and a worry about Afghans coming to the U.S. versus Ukraine.
Yeah. I've just been struck watching TV by how much like us the Ukrainians look.
Great, Gerard. You're right. You're right.
That's part of the reason I asked that question. What kind of vocational skills do the Afghanistans bring to the family?
They're like, it is a challenge for them, but most immigrant groups, for instance, a couple that I'm working with, Afghan couple, they were both prosecutors, a husband and wife were prosecutors in Afghanistan, and they've got a small baby, but they will not be able to become prosecutors anytime soon here in the US. Their degrees are from Afghanistan. Their experience are Afghanistan. And so translating that experience, and also they're still learning English, although they're both pretty, better than my Dari any day. But they oftentimes, immigrants will come to our country that have been professionals, and oftentimes they're not able to find jobs in those professions. And so many of the Afghans will become part of the service sector. He's looking at a job, this prosecutor, who is really one of the best known prosecutors in Afghanistan, prosecuting the Taliban crimes. He's looking at becoming a mechanic at one of the local shops. And that's not unusual, I think, for immigrants that come to our country, is they don't oftentimes have the opportunity to, at least initially, start in their profession. So starting over is tough. That's all I can say.
Yeah. Goodness. Such a big change in so many ways. And then trying to tackle that as well.
That's right.
After putting so much time into another profession. Yeah. Well, does anybody else have any other questions to ask? Anything else that you'd like to know?
If you hear a phone, that's mine. I'm sorry.
Okay. You're being called in.
Never get a phone call, but
I'd like to know where the Afghani refugees that are here, do they live all over the place? Do they tend to put them in certain complexes of apartments, or where are these people?
Yeah, they typically are in low income housing, because there's only a certain amount of money that the federal government gives and that the state government allows for housing cost. And, housing has been difficult for everyone. And particularly, so you'll tend to find them off of Russell Cave Road and some of the housing areas over there, off of Winburn, off of North Broadway, off of North Limestone. I'm thinking about some of the families that I visit with, some in the Lansdowne area where we have, apartment complexes. So that tends to sort of be where they're initially settled.
If you were going to do something like you were talking about, taking people to the store or doing, helping people run some kind of errands or do something, do you call the Kentucky Refugee Ministry, or how do you get involved in something like that?
I think Erin will post something for all of you. I had shared with Mark a website, a couple of websites, and you have to actually sign up to be a volunteer, and there's some training for it. and some vetting for it just to make sure that, but again, and there's a whole array of volunteer tasks. So, as I said, there's a lot of different ways to help. And then if you choose not to be a volunteer for some of the immigrant and refugee organizations, you can also be a voice in your community or in your groups, on behalf of Afghan refugees and also on behalf of what's happening in Ukraine. So there's a number of ways to help. But yeah, KRM and CRC, just to abbreviate, are the two organizations that are providing most of the services.
Yeah, that's a good question. I did find it. It's at lexcentral.com/Afghan-relief. And I did post it in the chat. We'll put it on the video too later so that folks can see that. But you can go there, and there's links to both of those organizations there where that'll kind of give you instructions on how you can sign up as well and help.
Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you. And there's also a place for financial donations, which go to, this is all kind of under the umbrella of the Interfaith Alliance of the Bluegrass. So there's a place for that as well there too. So, yeah. Well, any other questions?
I was just going to say, I really appreciate that, knowing where to donate money, because I'm always, I'm reluctant to just jump on and donate money unless I know, who's in charge of it and where it's going to go. I mean, people can sound good sometime.
No, I agree with you, Diane. And it's notorious after a crisis, like right now in Ukraine. There are all kinds of organizations that are soliciting donations that you want to be watchful of. Because there's, sadly enough, when there's human misery, there will also be scammers, people trying to make money off of the crisis. And so we do have to be thoughtful and to look for ways to make sure that they're credible organizations and to vet the organizations that we give money to and assistance to. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Well, anything
we didn't
else?
talk about Habitat for Humanity or Greenhouse 17 or all the other community organizations that I love in Kentucky. We have so many terrific nonprofits that are doing so much great work. And, whether it's immigration, Afghanistan, Ukraine, domestic violence, housing support, tutoring, education. I mean, it doesn't matter what you care about. You can find a way to be a part of some community service to that cause that you care about. So
the Refugee Ministry does a lot of vetting of the people who they bring over. So that's part of the reason why I think we have so much success with the refugees that come through the Refugee Ministry.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that, the Afghans who were evacuated in this terrible emergency in August, they just didn't get to come into the U.S. because they happened to be in a country that the government had fallen. They had to go through extensive security and medical vetting, both in the Mideast. Then when they landed in the U.S. at military bases, they had to go through it again, Homeland Security, FBI, Department of State, vet all these people again. So there is extensive vetting. You're right.
I so appreciate you making the connection after a career in so many places overseas, and you making the connection about how our service wherever we're at is important to the community. I think that this is a wonderful way to start this series to remind us that whatever we do, wherever we're at, we have ways that we can support our neighbors and make a difference. So
Aaron, actually, I have to say to you, I want to give you a special call out because I struggle with, I care about. One of the things that we have to recognize is that when we open up our hearts, it's a burden in a way because we start caring about so much. And it's easy to sort of feel overburdened that because, on any given day, it can be, child abuse in Kentucky, something terrible has happened on the news. It can be Ukraine. It can be an Afghan friend calls me and they have no food for the next day for their baby. It's just a range of things that we care about. And I oftentimes think, what is it that connects the people and the issues I care about? Because sometimes I feel a little like I'm bouncing around from issue to issue to issue. And a few weeks ago, Sunday morning, you were singing a song about, I'll try not to cry here, about love and peace and justice. And I can go back to our CBC, but it was at that moment that suddenly, it was like a light bulb that I thought, that's the connection for me. That's why, it's okay for me to care about Ukraine and Afghanistan and dog abuse and child abuse and child education and COVID, because all of those things are connected by love and about our desire for justice. And for some reason, what you said that Sunday just sort of made it connected it for me. And I had this enormous sense of, that's it. I don't have to try to figure out who I am any longer. I don't have to try to figure out, am I about international policy? Am I about domestic? Am I about education? Am I about elections? Am I about domestic violence? I felt like it's all okay because it's about love and it's about justice. So thank you.
Oh, well, hey, I'm I'm grateful to be part of that.
No, thank you.
So thank you. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it is all tied together, and it's hard to I think where we can find where our hearts start resonating, wherever that is, and it may be in many disparate places, but whenever it does, that's an opportunity for us to be able to jump in.
It's okay, right? To hear about one thing, and it's okay to care about many things. And so I sort of, that's the advantage of old age. You start becoming okay with who you are.
Yeah, thank you all for coming, and thank you so much, Deborah, for sharing with us and for helping us learn more about this and sharing from your heart too about how we can be involved. We're just so grateful to learn and also just to get the chance to talk with you and see how things are going.
No, it's been so nice talking with everyone. I've missed that in the last couple of years with COVID, certainly. Yeah. So. How nice. And thank you again. It's such an honor to sort of be on our inaugural Zoomcast.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for coming. And we'll see you all soon. Okay.
Good night, everyone. And thank you.
Okay. Bye.